No, run with it.
Okay, well, what's up, Hot Take Nation? DRW here. It is April 21st. We are doing our second live show. Today, we're going to try something a little different where we've had some people came in with some questions that they emailed. We'll get to those. We'll have some live people come on camera. If you want to ask a question live, if you email gcp@hottakeoftheday.com, producer Glenn can help orchestrate in the back room. So before we get to some of the questions, I know yesterday was kind of an interesting day for the world, something that has never happened before in the history of the world that I am aware of happened to oil, and that was that oil went negative. And not only did it go a little negative, it went deeply, deeply negative, closing at minus $37.63 a barrel, which, to put in context for listeners, a contract, a futures contract for the delivery of May, today is the last day it trades. And if I own one contract that I purchase, it means that I will take delivery of 1,000 barrels of oil. It's 1,000 barrels per contract. And so as of yesterday, someone was going to pay me $37,630 to house 1,000 barrels of oil. That is how crazy the supply-demand imbalance is right now. And a lot of people were asking yesterday and thinking about, so does that mean producers were selling? Well, no. Most producers sell their barrels far, far in advance of what happened yesterday. Some producers who would be using the Argus roll, like when we were at One Energy, we sold through Sunoco. And the Sunoco pricing mechanism was 2/3 of 1 month plus 1/3 of the following month was the Argus roll, net of a differential, and that was the price. So yesterday's closing price will factor into the price, but only 1/21st of the front month. And it'll combine with every day today, June, and they'll calculate it. So for most producers, they weren't really exposed to the $37 loss yesterday. Who was exposed were the speculators. And I know that there was a lot of articles talking about USO. USO is the United States Oil Fund, and it's an ETF which allows you to go long oil. They own oil contracts, but generally, because traders used to front run them, so that when they were closing out their one position and rolling it into the other, traders knew when they were doing that. So they would do weird market manipulations to manipulate USO. So USO was, as I understand it, closed out of their position going back like a week. So yes, they are a very, very large purchaser of speculative futures where they don't want to take the barrels. But yesterday wasn't USO. And there was an article I posted in the blog this morning that connected to a professor at the University of Houston who sort of talked through some of the more odd mechanics of that. And that basically it was a trader who didn't want to take the 1,000 barrels, although it was much, much, much more than that, and had to sell. But because it's a physical commodity, you have to take it. So like milk, if the price goes to zero right now, farmers are just dumping the milk because they don't need the milk. The cows aren't going to stop making the milk. For pork, there's not enough pork being bought because restaurants aren't buying bacon. And 70% of the bacon consumption in the United States happens in restaurants and food service. So unfortunately, what's happening is farmers are just going to euthanize the pigs. So there is a floor at which zero is a real thing. But in oil, the 1,000 barrels on that contract, it was coming. You were going to take it. And the trader was like, I can't take it. I will literally pay someone to move away. And the speculation of this article was sort of along the lines that some traders made some bets and pushed liquidity into the market to drive prices like that to make a financial gain. And so financial people, someone lost a lot of money yesterday and someone made a lot of money. And the person who made a lot of money probably is going to be investigated by the SEC. But for producers, yesterday's price action was kind of irrelevant. The price action that is massively relevant is the price action today. When we started going live, last I checked, oil was trading below $15 in June. The July contract was down about 12% to 22. August was down about 12% to 23. So forward months of crude where producers are selling into that market are showing substantial weakness. And why? Because the world produces 100 million barrels a day of crude. The world right now is consuming maybe 65. 35 million barrels a day of actual physical barrels have to get stored somewhere. There's a very inefficient market as to how you get those barrels to storage and who owns the storage. And the financial transactions that are occurring making these bets is what's manifesting in the market. So Walter asked a question before we got live, and he said, in your opinion, will the US government or regulatory curtailment actually happen, or will negative market forces be enough to make the shut-ins happen? I think as evidenced by the RRC, even though clearly producing is economic waste right now and is harmful to landowners, I don't think the regulatory bodies have the courage or the mandate to step in and stop it. I think the federal government could shut in all federal leases, which would include the offshore Gulf of Mexico, which is about 2 million barrels a day, and onshore, which is about 900,000. And if you remember my white paper that I wrote March 16th, it included that as the most efficient way to rebalance the market, was shutting in those wells, because Gulf of Mexico wells have to be shut in for hurricanes. So we know that they're built to shut in, they're built to stay shut in, and the reservoir damage mechanism, like these wells come back. So you could take 2.9 million barrels a day off, and the federal government is best positioned. What is going to happen now that June is trading at 14 is states like North Dakota, where it's all HBP, there are not continuous drilling clauses that I'm aware of in any major capacity. All the 1280s that are worth drilling are held. They don't need to do anything. So I think you're going to see 75% of North Dakota shut in. New Mexico, again, a state that doesn't have continuous drilling. You know, you maybe produce a well for a day a month or day a week or some small marginal thing to maintain the lease. But again, generally no continuous drilling in New Mexico. I think Colorado's the same way. I think Wyoming's the same way. I think there's elements of Oklahoma that's the same way. And I think Texas is obviously the big producer, where there's a lot more fee leases and continuous drilling clauses. But it is in the landowner's best interest to not be producing barrels at zero. So I think companies through time are going to reach out to those people, and that what we're going to see is a massive level of shut-ins now that the market will mandate. The federal government could step in and encourage some, and I would still if I was the federal government. But I think we're going to see 4 to 6 million barrels a day of U.S. production shut in. I think that the 9.7 million barrels a day shut in by OPEC is going to be substantially more in the next 15 or 20 days. I think the next OPEC meeting is June 10th, but by then, I mean, there'll be 1 billion barrels in storage in the next 30 days at this rate, and storage will be totally full. So I expect Saudi will cut probably 6 million barrels a day. I think Russia's going to have to cut 6 million barrels a day. I think Canada's going to have to cut a couple million barrels a day. We're going to see shut-ins so that the world is only producing 65 million barrels a day of crude, because that's all we're consuming. So that's the take. That's what happened. Obviously, if people have questions, reach out to Glenn and you can come on. We can talk about that. We have some pre-made questions, and this show is, the next hour is dedicated to you. Whatever you want to talk about, whatever you want to learn about, let's go. So Glenn, do we have any questions that you want to jump in with, or do we have someone in the waiting room that wants to come on and ask a question live?
Hey, David. Yeah, we've been joined by God's Will, and I'm going to put him on now.
Excellent. Godswill, how you doing, man? Thanks for joining the Hot Take of the Day live show. What's going on today?
Well, you know what? I'm excited to first time joining the video. I'm excited to join you guys. Meanwhile, thank you for all the great intelligence you've been sharing over the last couple of months, calming the nerves. We are looking at a couple of my friends, partners have been asking about the situation with the negative WTI crude oil pricing. And the question that they are concerned about is how will the deal that's been negotiated between the Russians and the Saudis, how is that going to affect the futures prices, both in the short term and the long term?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's probably, even for people who aren't in energy right now, it's probably the most important question. So on the one hand, it's very easy to make a very bearish bet on oil today and tomorrow and in June, because clearly, we are a commodity that is consumed. And so on the one hand, my biggest concern this whole time, God's will, has been storage. So if I put 100 million barrels in storage, that I buy those barrels from you, the producer, and I buy them at $10 a barrel, and I store them because I have capacity. The second oil is higher than $10 a barrel, I am going to liquidate my storage, and I am going to gain the profit, not the producer. So the OPEC question is a challenging one, because it's a question of who steals the economic rent. So if Saudi continues to produce, the barrels are being bought by someone who's going to store them in a tanker. And right now there's 160 million barrels of crude floating in super tankers on the ocean waiting to be sold. And so if I'm a storage guy, I'm going to buy those barrels and I'm going to leak them out to the market. And if I buy 1 billion barrels at 2 million barrels a day, that will take 500 days before the market can see normal economics. If you believe that producers aren't going to shut in, and I mean shut in 35 million barrels a day, then you have to go short, and oil will continue to be crushed until all of that storage is gone. If you believe that the Saudis and the Russians and the Americans and the Canadians and the Iranians and the Iraqis all shut in their wells because they realize that these prices, they're not covering costs, then less will go into storage, which means that the market will respond quicker. And when demand comes back, when we restart the economy, there won't be all these barrels in storage to be resold. So prices will naturally come up to the marginal cost, which I really still think is a $40 barrel. So that's the interplay. And so the short answer is, I don't know how depressed oil is going to be. But personally, I'm not making any bets buying or selling oil or oil stocks or anything, because until demand returns, or until I see what the Russians and Saudis actually do and what the Americans actually do, it's gambling at this point. Mm. Does that make sense in terms of it? Because sometimes that storage piece is missed. And certainly the government agencies are missing the fact that if I sell my oil from a BLM lease with a 12.5% royalty and I sell it at 10, the taxes that are being paid to the government and to the municipalities and to generally royalty owners are at 10, but then a financial player takes those barrels at 10 and resells them at 30, and they capture all of that margin with zero cost of production, zero royalties, and only income taxes. And that should be a real concern to the regulatory agencies and to landowners and to companies, that they're having their dollars stolen.
Mm. So another thing to people were concerned about is, the first, the basic framework of market pricing is that the market pricing captures an aggregate of everything that's actually happening in the ecosystem, including the economy, the political system, the socio-economic system, and everything. So, and the question that I've been getting recently is the current market price, is it capturing everything that is all the aggregates, all the components of the socio-economic situation, both within and international socio-economic situations? Is that the representation of the situation in terms of both the confidence and everything? The current market price. So
yes, and I think again that this is the important thing about how producers sell their barrels versus what the financial market is saying. And so, and I'll make a tie to the stock market too. Like Apple, their stock is being traded by people who own the company, but Apple themselves is not raising money through the stock. Okay. So the company issued stock, raised money, runs their business, and other than when management gets paid through options, they don't really care what the price of the stock is because they're not using it to raise money. So it's all the market. And so when I think about commodities and the oil price and gas price futures, companies are writing physical contracts to sell their commodities and selling them 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years into the future. And once the company has said, okay, I have a contract or I have hedging or I have whatever, it's all financial from that point on. And so the market today reflects everyone's perspective as to supply, demand, economics, transition, energy, petrochemicals, transportation, airlines, flights, and the strip price is the best view of the future. And the further out in the future, the less financial bets are being made. So the further out you are, the less accurate it is.
Of course.
So the most accurate, which is why it's quoted on CNBC or whatever, is the June month of crude is quoted today for the next 30 days. And that's the best guess as to what a barrel of crude traded on the spot market is. But producers generally don't sell in the spot market. So it's just financial hedge fund people making bets on both sides predominantly with very, very little actual physical barrels. And then yesterday and today, when the contract for May expires, is when people are like, oh my God, I don't want that production. I can't take 1,000 barrels. I don't have anywhere to put it. Get rid of it. So I mean, that's the future. But again, I mean, I think it touches on the point of hedges. A lot of companies will be press releasing, don't worry, we have hedges. Well, those hedges are financial. And so they can sell their hedges today. And what I've heard is that banks are willing to sell very, very short term, like 1 or 2 months, but they're not wanting to cash out positions a year in the future because the prices are so bad right now that the banks have to lock in a loss. And the banks are like, there's no way the prices are going to be this depressed. So we're going to let you cash out in May and June and July, maybe. Mm-hmm. And the company can sell that. And if they really needed to, they could buy back the physical barrels to fit a demand. But when I started my career in 1998, hedging got a bad name because there was a company called Canadian 88. And the numbers will be a little bit wrong, but they hedged at $2 and gas prices went to $5. Mm-hmm. And they hedged 200 million barrels MCF a day, but they were only producing 100. Mm. So they had to buy MCFs at 5 to fulfill their contract at 2 because they were short 100 million a day. And so in Canada, one of the reasons that hedging was so frowned upon was because that bankrupted that company. And so companies today hedge less barrels than they actually produce. And right now, all the producing companies that have hedges are so strongly in the money that they can sell those hedges and pay back bank debt or do whatever they want because they can always buy physical barrels for cheaper than they're currently hedged. And so the excuse of, well, we're hedged, so we're not worried, to me is like sell the hedge as a financial transaction and run your business as a physical commodity. And the physical price right now is 0. So what are you doing? So does that answer the question? Hopefully a lot of really good questions there, God's will. Appreciate you being the first caller live on the hot take of the day. And I
appreciate all the knowledge you've been sharing over the last couple of months. And Glenn, nice to talk to you guys. I appreciate you.
Awesome. Thank you. Glenn, this is working great. Do we have another caller? How do we shift here? How long do I believe the US will be the marginal barrel? I mean, forever, right? Forever. And so how does that structurally work? And look, all the shorts are going to tell you, I've been telling you forever, shale doesn't work. Shale is just using people's debt, and we should be conventional. No, all the conventional oil, and Glenn, maybe you can pull it up. I don't know that. So I'll ask you if we have a chart of US production going back to 1973. Don't even know how you'd pull it up, but if you do, there was a little blip in 1985, but the conventional business in America was on decline since 1973. All the barrels that cost $10, $20, $30, $40, $50, $60 that were conventional were gone. And by 2008, we found the Bakken. And yes, we did not capitalize the US growth. In 2008, the US was producing 5 million barrels a day. the world economy was collapsing. And we'll tie back to this, but it is collapsing today worse than the worst financial crisis ever. Make no mistake. And so we'll talk about COVID, but only very ancillarily. The only business that was working to loan money to in 2008 was oil. And bankers make money on fees when they loan money. So real estate was dead, housing was dead, banking was dead, but you could give money to oil and gas companies to go drill this thing called the Bakken. So they did. And they loaned money because there was nowhere else to get yield. And that went for 12 years. And over those 12 years, the US grew with one pause in 2014 from 5 million barrels a day to 13. And shale barrels cost $50 to $60 to make. And so, as you know, if you followed the hot take of the day for a long time, you know that I was positioned because I believed the US started declining oil because of declining inventory and high decline rates in November 2019. And the EIA report in November 2019 shows 12.833 million barrels were produced per day. And then December declined, January declined, and February declined. And that was all before COVID. So when I called for peak oil USA in September, we hit it in November. And that was because there wasn't any inventory left. And that was positioning a declining US market against inclining demand, no coronavirus, and prices were going to stay at 60. And we still would have declined. But we need 50 to 60 to be profitable in the US. And right now, oil is 10. And we are pumping 35 million barrels a day into storage every single day, which means now after 30 days, there will be 1 billion barrels in storage owned by financial players who will trickle that back to the market and depress oil prices, to me, to the low 40s for the next 36 months. Will there be spikes? There's always spikes for geopolitics, but short of a war in the Middle East or tariffs on imported oil, which would more negatively impact Canada because I think 75% of our imports are actually Canadian. But short of those two things, there's no reason for oil to be above 40. The US doesn't warrant investing in any oil wells at $40. And if the Saudis and Russians can snap their fingers, or if a pandemic can change demand, investors who are already fleeing the industry for a whole bunch of reasons are not going to give oil drillers money to drill shale oil wells at $40, which means to the question of how long will the US be the marginal barrel until Saudi and Russia and Libya and Iran and Iraq and Canada and Norway and Brazil deplete all of their oil that is less than $40 to produce. And then and only then will price need to be in the 50s to justify investment for oil. So when I say that oil as an investment in the US is dead, that is the reason, is because there's no compelling case that oil should trade at more than 40, because for every month of the economy being shut down is at least a year that barrels will be trickled out of storage and crush oil demand, oil prices, which is why on March 7th, I also became bullish natural gas eventually. Because if the US can't invest in oil, we will decline 4 million barrels a day in the next 365 days. And we will decline 2 to 3 million barrels the year after that, which means that the US will go from 13 million barrels a day to 6. Those 6 million barrels come with 24 to 30 BCF a day of associated gas. If you don't have oil production creating associated gas, and there's no economics to drill oil in a $40 world, that means that natural gas has 25% less gas being produced in the country, which means that the gas price has to go up to encourage drilling in the Marcellus and the Haynesville to offset that, which is why a stock like EQT has traded up 100% in the last month. It's a relative trade where people who have to be invested in energy were invested in oil, which was the only thesis you could have before. And now that the world has changed, oil is the worst thesis, and you have to think about natural gas. And so that explains why EQT is trading up. That explains why oil companies, like, no one wants to buy the stock until demand comes back and we see who goes bankrupt or not. But you can't put new money to work in this oil environment until the economy comes back. So that's why I believe the US is the marginal barrel, and why we will stay the marginal barrel for basically ever. Glenn, what else do we got? Do I think companies solely focused on refining, manufacturing petroleum products are advantaged? Thinking crack spread. So yeah, you will not likely get paid to fill up your truck. So the thing about oil is, very clearly it's an inelastic demand. 100 million barrels a day used to be consumed. 65 million barrels of those were for transport. And short of $140 a barrel, which we did see, and it did cause demand destruction, and consumers stopped buying big trucks and big SUVs to be more fuel efficient, and cars built cars to be more fuel efficient. Other than that really, really, really high price that destroyed demand, low prices aren't going to stimulate any demand. And so does a refiner make more money because of the crack spreads? Kind of, but there's so much capacity built in the US to create gasoline for transportation that at this point, refineries are being shut in because there's nowhere to store the gasoline. Tomorrow is Wednesday. The EIA releases their weekly and petroleum status report every week on Wednesday at 8:30 Mountain. You should read it every day. And for the last every week, every Wednesday. For the last 1 month, you've seen that gasoline inventories have increased. Crude oil inventories have increased. All of the inventories of crude products are increasing. So there's nowhere to put it. So even if you consume crude, like an airline would be benefiting right now from their hedges. Well, actually, they'd be losing from their hedges because they'd be out of money. But if they weren't hedged, airlines would be buying cheap fuel, but they're not flying. And the question is, will they ever fly at the pace they flew before? Because you need 100% of society to go back to the way they were. And I'm going to go back to the way I was, but there's probably 20 or 30 people, some of you listening right now might not go back to the way you were. You might be afraid to get on a plane. You might not want to go on your vacation. You might lose your job and not be able to go on your vacation. You might be using Zoom and not need to travel with your work anymore. So airlines won't consume the same amount of crude they had before. And cars, do you really need to drive to work if you're telecommuting and there's still forces? You know, are you going to go on your driving vacation this winter? Are you going to do those things? I don't know. So right now, the market is broken. Very clearly, we saw that yesterday with $37 a barrel negative. So a conventional world would say, yes, the consumers of the crude would benefit today. In the world that we're in today, I don't think anyone is benefiting from these low prices, except for maybe China, who's buying barrels into storage, and maybe Saudi and Russia, because now the US will not be able to invest in crude. So they will be the largest share percentage-wise of crude in the post-COVID world for the foreseeable future. Good question. Thank you. So SAGD wells, there's a lot of talk, and I think I'm going to do a post on it tomorrow where management teams, when they say, are you shutting in wells? They're like, no, we're really afraid of damage. That to me is a very simple answer that reflects that management is scared to do something as opposed to using data. So I will say to SAGD is a Canadian-centric technology that is called steam-assisted gravity drainage, where you drill 2 horizontal wells on top of each other because the crude is like 10 API. We actually did a project when I was in Canada. Man, when I started my career, it was like 1999 or 2000. And it was called the swimming development. We ended up selling the whole thing to CNRL when we exited Canada. But swimming had 8-degree API oil, like 8 degree. That is like not even toothpaste. So what you do is you inject steam in one of the wells and you produce through gravity drainage. So steam in the upper one creates a steam chamber, which warms the oil and changes the viscosity so that it can flow. And with gravity assistance, it can flow into the well. And then the hot oil, you leave the pump and it can pump. So if you stop the injection of steam, then that cools. That steam chamber that facilitates the production of oil at a warm temperature, therefore lower viscosity, it will take a long time for that to come back. And so, yes, there is a true mechanism in a SAGD well that shutting in is not ideal. Now, can you slow production? Can you keep injecting steam for a month at a half rate and still produce at a half rate? Each well, each company, each play, you have to be able to determine. But SAGD is a real one. The other one was in heavy oil, really shallow heavy oil that wasn't SAGD in Canada. They would use a PCP pump. And what they figured the production mechanism was wormholes. So the sand was unconsolidated and you would be producing through a PCP and sucking sand and oil, and those wormholes would be in the reservoir and bringing oil with it. And that was almost like a naturally induced fracture, even though that's not what it is, but just stick with me on the analogy. And it would suck oil in. And if you shut those in, then the sand, the unconsolidated sand would collapse and it would take time to recreate the wormholes. And sometimes they didn't get created the same way. And so you would have damage. Again, that is a true damage mechanism. Water floods where you have 98% water. And let's be clear, there are not a lot of water floods, and it's certainly not the resource, the unconventional play. But water floods, yeah, you can have water banks or CO2 floods. You can have CO2 banks that are in a different form of water alternating gas injection, or you can be in a bank where, you know, if you don't continue to produce, you can have issues. But we're talking about oil on the margin. We're not talking about the 8 million barrels a day that are horizontal, unconventional. So what is the damage mechanism in those wells? We pump hundreds of thousands of barrels of compatible fluid to frack them. So if you shut them in after they've cleaned up, what is the mechanism for damage? Rel perm, because you're leaving water on the reservoir, the water that you pumped in the frack? No. How about when you do an offset frack and you inject water into wells to help repressure them to prevent parent-child interaction? Do those wells come back on? Yeah, because otherwise in your economics, you would have to include the degradation of those offset wells, which no company was doing. And that was a real mechanism that companies were doing to protect wells. How about just shutting in the offset pair to allow them to rebuild pressure? Is that a thing people do? Yeah. Do they leave them shut in for 30 days? And did they come back? Yes. And do most wells repressure and have flush production? And that flush production allows you to catch up on the cumulative EUR because you don't lose EUR because there is no damage mechanism for it? Yes. So, you know, and we have coming up on a podcast that we're going to release next week. We have Breezy Carlson, who's a lawyer with the Kuiper law firm, talking about shut-ins and leases. The lease provisions are important. Continuous drilling clauses. What is the mechanism by which I'm holding that lease? Can I produce this well 1 day a month, 2 days a month? Do I need to rotate week on, week off? How do I manage my contracts? You have a massive land and legal team that has been tracking your leases forever. There are ways to shut these wells in safely to reduce production by 50% because, make no mistake, there is nowhere to put the oil. So I went on a little bit of a rant. Hopefully it was rantastic, and I demonstrated my commanding knowledge of reservoir engineering across all the reservoirs in North America. But yes, SAGD wells are a problem. Heavy oil wormhole PCP wells can be a problem. Water floods and CO2 floods can be a problem, but the bulk of oil that we're talking about is unconventional resource plays, that there is no damage mechanism whereby they are damaged. And if they come back damaged, it is because the well was overestimated as an EUR in the first place. There we go. Boom. Yes, that is the majority. I mean, you at this point, you have to risk the damage to the reservoir. So number one, you can't spend capital. And I said this March 7th. Companies don't like to come out and say things because they're afraid, I don't know, people are too stupid. Kind of like politicians don't like to say, hey, protect yourself. If you're sick, stay home. If you have a weak immune system, stay home. Generally, COVID is killing older, less healthy people with comorbidities. And so, like, protect yourself. Companies didn't want to say March 7th that this is the end of investment in oil in North America for the next 3 years, and 80% of jobs are going to go away because without capital activity, you don't need those jobs. That was very scary for them to say. But make no mistake, Canada and the US are going to go to zero completions because completing new oil into this market makes no sense. Therefore, you don't need to drill the wells. Therefore, drilling is also going to go to zero. SAGD wells might be losing wells. Heavy oil might be losing money. And so the choice is shut it in, risk the damage, shut in the wells that you know won't be damaged, or accept that they might never come back on. And so you have a choice. Do I take $0 a barrel for a period of time and not shut my wells in and risk all of the resource that I spent capital that needs $50 to $60 to get a return? Do I waste my resources at zero when I need 50? Or do I say, screw it, I got to shut them in and we're going to see what happens. I'm going to reduce the steam injection 50%. I'm going to reduce production by 70%, and I'll keep the well kind of going and we'll see. And I'll slow down my heavy oil wells in half, or I'll, turn them on, one off, one on, one off. But again, if we're having this conversation, you are by definition the marginal barrel. Saudi is not having this conversation. Russia is not having this conversation. Gulf of Mexico is not having this conversation. Norway is not having this conversation. If our wells are so sensitive that we can't turn them off, they are by definition the marginal barrel. And that is why oil investment will never go back to the way it was. That is why oil as an investment in the next 3 years is not the place you want to be investing your money. That will have spin-off ramifications 100%. But the fact that people are even saying, oh my God, my well is so sensitive, I can't turn it off. Think about what that means for that type of oil in this world, which is so oversupplied. And if demand doesn't go right back, what if the demand only goes to 98 or 97 or 96 million barrels? February feels like a long time ago, but do you remember that Chinese demand was down 3 million barrels a day in January and February? China was the only place that had locked down. We can talk about the data if anyone has any questions on it, but it's interesting. They went from 13 million barrels a day to 10. And that 3 million barrels of out of the market reduced oil from 62 January 3rd, with an Iranian general assassinated, by the way, to 50. Which was $12 a barrel for 3 million barrels of lost demand. We are 10 times that. So if the world only goes back to 97 million barrels a day, which is 3 million barrels below where it used to be, that's $12 a barrel depressed. Plus you're selling out of storage at 3 million barrels a day extra. So oil stays in the 20s or 30s for like 24 months, which justifies zero capital investment in oil in North America. So that's the what happens to Canada shutting in wells. It's ugly. I agree. It's really good. I mean, look, if you read the Hot Take of the Day blog, I would point you to a Technical Tuesday I wrote back when the world was normal, and it was on Antero Resources, and I wrote it as a murder mystery because it was more fun to do that way. But Antero, in order with their firm transport and their ad valorem, their cost per MCF before they even drill a well is $1.95. Why? Because the Marcellus grew from 0 BCF a day, Appalachia region, from 0 in 2010 to 35 BCF a day now. And there was no pipeline for those MCF. So midstream companies forced the companies that wanted to grow to sign firm contracts to take or pay capacity. gas had been trading, and I was the most bearish on gas you could be, because there's so much of it. It's so cheap to produce, and it was coming with associated gas in the Permian that there was no economics to drill. And that's why gas was trading at $1.60, $1.70. And Antero, before they even drilled a well, their cost was $1.95. And to put that into perspective, in February, when they talked about their 2020 plan, they were going to grow production at 8% because it was less expensive for them to grow and fill their firm transport than it was to pay the cost of their firm transport and not have those molecules. How crazy is that? They were spending $250 million a year on transportation they weren't using. So we're now going to lose 4 million barrels a day of associated oil in the Permian, which comes with, at 4,000 to 5,000 GOR, it comes with 15 to 20 BCF a day of gas. That gas is no longer in the market. Therefore, gas prices have to elevate in order to encourage more Marcellus development, which therefore means gas will float up to $2.50 or $3 or $3.25 an MCF, so that gas producers can backfill all of the gas that was lost with oil. And by the way, natural gas has a lower CO2 footprint than coal. And by the way, carbon and climate change, if you remember, was kind of a big deal before. And natural gas is a great answer for that. And by the way, we're about to enter into the largest global depression in the history of the world, including 1929, in my opinion, which means that electricity demand will not go back to where it was before COVID, which means that only existing power, existing windmills, existing solar, existing natural gas plants, because there will be no capital to build new shit. There just won't be. So then natural gas will be used to backfill the existing natural gas plants. As coal comes out, natural gas, because you're not going to pay money to put in new windmills. Nobody can afford those. And by the way, since oil has declined and there's such an anti-Russia and Saudi and Iran and Iraq movement, when American consumers can afford a new car because their old car fell apart because they had to drive it for 15 years because they didn't have a job, when they buy a new car, it will likely be hybrid or electric, and it will use a low cost fuel like natural gas. And by the way, the only way we're going to replenish the jobs in America after we lose another 25 million in the next month, and we have more than 50 million Americans not working, is by bringing jobs back from overseas that we used to offshore our production of manufacturing to China, where 74% of their electricity is generated from coal-fired electricity, which generates very high pollution and very high CO2. And if we think that this was part of a Chinese plot to move the economy and to damage the US, the Make America Great Again consolidation of everything into the US is going to need more power, which is going to be funded by natural gas. So the mid and long-term thesis for natural gas is very good. But you need natural gas to go above 250 in order for them to make any money. And so that's the problem. What else we got, Glenn? Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico, again, conventional, very expensive, very big reservoirs, good economics. But if you think back to 2014 and the lack of investment in the Gulf of Mexico that occurred from 2014 to 2020, the reason was because the Gulf of Mexico there was some gas, like the Independence Hub that Anadarko had. That gas investment went away because gas was basically being given away. Oil used to be 100 and then it was 50 and now it's 20. Gulf of Mexico takes 2, 3, 4 years to develop. And so the Spoken hub was the rage. You had this little field that wouldn't justify development by itself, but it was hub and spoke to existing infrastructure. So you could kind of tie back because you wanted to keep your infrastructure full. Wouldn't that have been a good idea in the US if we had just kept our infrastructure full instead of growing? I digress. But the economics at 50 are poor. They're good once it's producing and it's great quality oil. But at 50, why would you invest in Gulf of Mexico? Like, if you're truly Exxon and you have the ability to go international, why would you not be investing in international barrels, which are cheaper? And it's been proven that Saudi and Russia can change the dynamic. So I don't think that the Gulf of Mexico is going to see a whole bunch of incremental investments. And any incremental investment in the future is going to have to come with a massive hedge, where you hedge all of your forward production at 100%, because the investors, like, I don't want to expose myself to 20. I don't want negative 37 a barrel. I'll get wiped out. So I demand that you hedge all of your production. Well, then the risk comes back to that story I started with in 1997 with Canadian 88. You think the well is going to do 100,000 barrels a day. It actually does 50,000 barrels a day. You hedged at $150. Oil goes to 100. So now you're fulfilling makeup volumes by buying barrels that are higher because you missed your production forecast. Has the reservoir engineer in economics ever missed their production or their type curve? Yeah, happens all the time. That's why you can't pre-hedge volumes. But if you don't pre-hedge volumes, you can't justify the investment, so nobody invests. So I am not bullish on Gulf of Mexico at all. I am bullish on Appalachian and Haynesville gas to backfill the loss. I think that's the play that's left in North America for energy. Yeah, 100%. And I had, I'd speculated going back to October. So the question's, let's say shale goes away, and there was a lot of evidence that it was going to go away. Again, it was going to shrink. Therefore, it was going to have less influence in the world. All that's changed now because of economics. But yes, I thought EOG was actually going to go international, which was sort of going to be the announcement of the end of shale, because the technology and the skills of American companies and historically the access to capital has been great. The challenge was rule of law. Like, you go and do a deal with Libya and then they change the laws, or you go do a deal with Venezuela, they change the laws. Colombia, all these places that have oil have structural problems with the rule of law. But our big companies are going to do something. We are going to need energy security. And if the US is declining and prices are low, the only option is to go elsewhere. And so the irony is, if you think back to when I started my career in 2000, the Senate was holding hearings on energy problems in the US. And that was why natural gas grew in shale gas to what it was to feed America's energy. We will always need energy. And the wars in the Middle East and our interest in the Middle East, and Silk Roads is a great book if you haven't read it, in terms of the history of the Middle East going back thousands of years and then culminating in oil. They have a resource that we need. And we cared about that region before when we didn't have oil. And so the last 10 years have all been, we can pull out from the Middle East because we have American energy independence. We have all the oil we want. We have shale. I don't really care about that. We're totally fine. Well, how fast has the world changed? Now that we need oil, we need to get more engaged in Middle Eastern politics. And Middle Eastern politics, because of the scarcity of that resource, has always led to war and instability. So this COVID crisis and this death of the American oil industry has massive ramifications geopolitically in terms of the instability of countries that have oil that now are going to become important again to the United States. Fayetteville. Fayetteville gas, obviously, higher cost than the Haynesville, higher cost than the Marcellus. My question to you would be, if the Fayetteville is the marginal gas of the United States, it's not. The Piceance very clearly is. You're at the end of all the pipelines. You're in the Rockies. You have a negative regulatory environment. Like, Piceance is like the last place you want to be. But Fayetteville is kind of not that far behind it. So is there gas? Yes. Does it work at 350 or 4? Yes. How much gas needs to be produced out of the Marcellus before there's only $3 or $4 gas left? And so let's take the lesson from oil, which is when you're the marginal barrel in the world, someone else can fluck with your economics. See, I didn't even swear there. That was pretty good. The Fayetteville can have every other gas player, including LNG from overseas, including Canadian gas, can displace Fayetteville gas. So this should be a lesson. You need to be in the place with the best economics and the best quality. That's why in 2016, 17, and 18, everyone went to the Permian because it had the most inventory, the most pay, the least child wells, the best differentials, and it was everywhere. The Permian was the only place you could really make sustainable oil investments at a $50 to $60 world and matter. That's why people went to the Permian, and that's why people were paying $35,000 an acre. At 20, nothing works. So in natural gas, it's exactly the same thing. The Fayetteville is not the place you want to be exposed if you can get access to the Marcellus, because the Marcellus is the best gas resource and can provide all the gas the US needs for a very long period of time. Why is EFT anti-DRW? So that is partly my fault, for sure. I am a fairly polarizing character. I'm not sure if you know this. And generally speaking, when I'm not in DRW mode, which is a real part of me, to be clear, I'm actually kind of like a funny guy and like fun to hang out with and fun to have drinks with. And, you know, clearly I talk a lot. I got that. But I'm also combative, and I'm combative on data. And so when we sold One Energy and I had left Franklin Mountain, I took a larger position in Twitter. I've always been against Twitter, but I went on as myself. And the EFT community, as you know, is anonymous. And anonymous really delinks the human element, I think, because you can say whatever you want and your track record is never exposed. So I was me engaging with people who wanted to engage about how the shale is dead, conventional is better, debt, dumb people, stupid companies, greedy management teams. You got lucky, you're horrible, you're a bitch, you're a whatever. And as me, with my track record and my reputation, I engage the way I do in LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, you have to use your real name. So people, that does prevent people from saying whatever they want. And so, you know, I'm not going to call myself the anti-hero, but I certainly was posing I still respect Vicky Hollub. I think what she did was right. I think she got caught in a black swan event, and that's going to spin a whole bunch of criticism. But I think that that's a real topic. EFT hates that. I believe in shale oil, and I was positioned for $60 oil. That was what my investments were. And I believe I would have been right on my company calls. Oil's not 60. The thesis has changed. I got into Twitter, like long-standing fights with people, and I argued as me, and I probably was as cheeky as they were, except they know who I am. And so I think that probably turned some people off. And then, you know, I said, this is not healthy for me as a person to be engaged in this toxic discussion where I'm not making any friends and I'm not having a real conversation with people with their real name. So I'm off. So I just chalk it up to politics. You're not going to win. You're not going to win everyone's like, and that's what happened. So big learning for me on social media for sure. You know, clearly BRV. I mean, BRV and I would text actually before, an Energy Cynic, the same thing, and there's a couple others I would text with. And BRV made a massive short call and made $4 million. I think is what the Reuters article said. I don't begrudge BRV at all. They had a thesis, they bet the thesis, they made money on the thesis. Congratulations. We made a thesis at One Energy around what the Permian would do and what it would be and how you would sell an asset into a world that didn't need consolidation at the time. We broke the asset up, we sold it in 4 pieces. We were able to be successful. I'm now able to do this. You know, that should be a congratulations and enough of that. So that's the EFT, my answer to EFT, but I'm sure it's more nuanced than that. I mean, yes and no. I think very clearly we see I honestly believe, and I'm not saying this to be a hot take. I don't usually say things to be a hot take. In fact, I never do. I always say what I believe, and then I defend it with data. People just don't sometimes like it. I believe 80% of oil and gas jobs are going to go away forever. Now, that is going to disproportionately impact people later in their career because they won't hang around to stay, not because they're being laid off. So yes, 80% of the executive teams, there won't be anywhere for them to invest. There won't be private equity to give them money. There won't be rock to buy. There won't be new plays to be had. There won't be economics. So if 80% of people lose their jobs, by definition, this is the last hurrah. Now, I want to pose that in a really good way, which is the reason I love this industry, and I think the reason everybody loves this industry, is because it's the most interesting industry in the world. We work in a complex regulatory environment where I remember my job at Enerplus was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Corps of Engineers, the BLM, the NDIC, the EIA. All those regulatory agencies oversaw everything we did. We had to build out infrastructure. We had to build out wells. We had to do economics and understand economics. We had to work with the finance people. We had to work with geologists, engineers, land people, accounting people, different layers of government and regulatory. And every day, thousands of wells would have new data that you would have to interpret very quick, knowing that you were going to be wrong, but make the best decision you possibly could. And when I think about those skills, they are so transferable to every industry. And our people love our industry, and we've been stuck here. So if 80% lose their job, our talent and our knowledge and our skills are going to be shared with the rest of the world. And if there's anything oil and gas people are, it is they're risk takers and entrepreneurs, no matter where you are at whatever company. We take risk, we make bets, and we tie them to economics. I believe that oil and gas people are going to be able to have wonderful careers outside of energy because of the skills they've built. And the world is now totally different than it was. All the companies that were built like airlines, like hotels, were built for the old economy. And now there's the new economy, whatever that is. And all of our people are going to be at the beginning of that to be able to start companies where before they didn't want to leave the industry. So I think that's really important. I also think that all those skills tie so well with politics, because what do we see politicians do? Cater to a very small group and not use data, only use sound bites, and not change their mind when new data is coming out all the time. People who are in oil and gas, who are willing to tolerate it, I think need to consider government and city jobs and local jobs and state jobs, because it's very clear how important their impact is on our life. And we've all not wanted to do it because we've been doing something else more fun. But if ever there was a time that we need strong politicians and strong government, it's now, because we're about to enter the worst period of economic depression in the US history. And we need smart people to build policy, to look at data and change the way the world is going to run. So for all the oil and gas people that lose their jobs, expand your mind beyond energy. Use your skills, think about public service, and think about all of the new businesses you can start, because the world is your oyster. Well, Glenn, that's our hour, man. Political aspirations, recent posts, frustration. Is this real ambition? Yes. Yeah, I don't think that it's a surprise. Now, to the question on EFT, and it's very related. I am a data-driven person who is willing to get into an argument and say sound bitey things that sound harsh. So Jordan Timms, who I always enjoy, he sent me a note. We were conversing yesterday, and he said, kudos. We were talking about something, and he said, someone's probably going to graffiti on your tombstone. You are a COVID denier and you hate your mother. And so my challenge in politics is going to be to be more of a softer, emotionally driven person who can connect with everyone and be able to make the points I'm making in a way that isn't partisan and can implement positive changes. I believe in the greater good. I believe that a society is only as strong as its weakest people. And I believe that in the role of government is in chaotic times like war, like COVID, to do the best answer for the most number of people to keep society running, and for the rest of it, stay the hell off. So yes, do I have political aspirations? Only because I feel like we need better politicians. And so I want to have the chance to drive policy, to make better decisions, to make people's lives better. Is that a local? Probably starts local. I think state is probably as far as I'd want to go. But if there's an opportunity federally, and that this is a narrative that resonates, you know, I always say your career is a river and you don't know where you're going to go. So to me, the decision is to get in the river politically and see where it goes. And if that's Department of Energy as a non-elected official, that's something. If it's a local, you know, councilman in Denver or whatever city it is at the time, then I'll follow that. But yeah, it is serious. Need to explore a lot of details because I've never really considered it before. So thanks for that question. Oh, I did want to get to that, and I appreciate that. I know you sent me an email before. So TC Energy, I think and this will be the midstream question that I think captures everything. Midstream works because they grow pipelines and spend capital for growth. Now, if I'm right that oil is going to decline, and COVID is certainly going to make it decline, we have all the pipe for oil we will ever need in this country. And it's already in the Permian and in the Bakken and in other places. And so, like, midstream companies don't need to spend on new infrastructure. TC Energy's plan was to spend $30 billion on capital infrastructure for pipelines for growth. If the industry isn't growing, their capital doesn't need to be spent. If they're not spending capital, they're not generating incremental return, which means that their business stagnates. And in a stagnating business that doesn't grow, you're not needed, and you consolidate and you lay off people and you go exactly the same as the upstream goes. So I am not bullish midstream because there's nowhere for them to spend capital. The gas plays in the Marcellus are overbuilt very clearly because firm transport, there's a tremendous amount of capacity and companies weren't using it. So that's out. Keystone XL, well, if oil is being imported from other countries and Canada's not investing, do we really need more at this point in the cycle without tariffs around North America? Probably not. So is that one? There's so much activism, and we have a great episode coming up with Tisha Schuler, who is a fascinating woman. And we talked all things activism, environmentalists, and government policy, and just went through the whole things. But activists wake up every day and say, how can I make the world a better place? And they're grounded in righteousness. And they believe what they're doing is making the world a better place. And so 2 or 3 pipeline protesters stopped the pipeline to export energy. And the energy industry has not responded to that very effectively. So to TC Energy's plan, they want to build pipe when nobody wants it into a world that isn't growing, when the lowest cost of the resource is either fully served in the Marcellus or coming from international. I don't see how that's a recipe for a good business model. Just like WeWork, let's cram a whole bunch of people that don't know each other into a very, very small office with a lot of glass on a short-term basis and have them come in and out through common areas so they can feel part of the world. Like, is that not other than a subway, is that not the perfect place to get the flu? Going to say that business model probably isn't the best idea anymore. And I'm not sure that TC Energy is either. Thank you for that question. I'm sorry I didn't get to it earlier.
I think that's it.
Boom.
Wait, we've got one more from Walter.
Okay. Walter, jump in, baby. I mean, yes, but again, this is like, think about patriotism and nationalism. So I was born in New York, so I'm American. I grew up in Canada, so I feel connected to Canada as well. And then I moved back to the US. And one of the things I noticed when I was early in my career at Anadarko was we would bring a lot of American expats, since Anadarko was an American company. American expats would come to Canada, and the cultural nuances were very different. So executive leaderships had very American views, and the workers had very Canadian views. Neither's good, neither's bad. They just are different. And that ultimately created a scenario where if you look at the world today, most American companies have mostly American assets. Most Canadian companies have mostly Canadian assets. Most international companies are the governments, the national oil companies, and they're working domestically, trying to hire domestic staff for their own domestic energy. If you think about 3M and the masks that we were exporting, and Trump was like stopping exporting of 3M's masks to Canada, the N95 masks, because we were more interested in nationalism, that is bad news for companies. Like Exxon is no longer relevant like it used to be. Saudi Aramco is relevant. Rosneft is relevant. Total is relevant, because you have these massive government-led nationalist countries and companies. So does the Canadian and American midstream company going overseas to go build pipe in the Ukraine make sense? Or does a Ukrainian company hiring advisors who happen to be American, who happen to know things, make more sense? Yeah. And then does the capital and all of the wins of that resource happen for that local economy? Yes. And is that one of the ways the US is going to move out of this Great Depression that we're going to go into? By bringing jobs that we had previously sent to China and Vietnam and Thailand for manufacturing, bringing those back. And yes, will that cost more money? Yes, but we're going to put national interest first. So that's why I don't believe that a midstream company has the scope and scale to be able to compete. And even Apple, right? Apple builds phones. Everyone loves the phones. They have a very sticky brand. But Huawei, if I said that right, you know, the Huawei Chinese company, they have 1.3 billion people who are nationalistic Chinese who are currently buying Apple. You don't think that Huawei is going to move that central phone and really displace Apple? And so that's what the trade war was about in the first place, was allowing US access to the Chinese market. But COVID is the perfect example of why national interest is always going to come first. So I really, Walter, I really don't see how midstream players have a role internationally, because there's enough capital to invest in those other countries that they don't need our expertise, and they in particular don't need our money, because our government money right now is going to fund a fiscal stimulus plan in an economy that's tanking, with tax revenues that are being decreased, and a world that will have 50 million unemployed Americans. Nobody's going to care about what's happening in the international gas market in Colombia, in my opinion. Yeah, I mean, and again, tax issues and stuff, but I would say no. We have a real issue on how people are going to make money, because, you know, there's two certainties in life: death and taxes. Except that now taxes, if you don't have jobs and you don't have small businesses providing jobs and selling income to pay property taxes, which pays the government, which pays schools, which pays hospitals, which paves roads, which builds electrical infrastructure and makes society work. When tax revenue drops, you cannot print money to get out of it. This solution that we're implementing is bad. And so, yeah, the MLP growth and yield and stuff, we have so much bigger problems that we're going to have to deal with in the next 10 years. And ultimately is why I think I have to go into politics, because I don't know that I trust the leaders that are there right now to think through how to do it for the best and for the most people. So there you have it.
Okay. I think that's it for right now, David. So I want to also have a shout out and thank you once again to Godswill for joining us.
Thanks, man.
Thank you very much. Glad you were able to join us.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hopefully that was fun. That was fun for everyone. I think, again, your brand is a river, and so we're trying the live show because it can be a little bit more responsive. Hopefully we touched on all the questions. As always, you can email me, drw@hottakeoftheday.com. And I try and answer all the emails and be as helpful as possible. If you have suggestions on what to do with the show, I think we're going to continue doing this on Tuesdays, kind of around this time frame, and see what we do. Have some guests come in as well. Until next time, thanks for joining us. Be safe, be good, have a great week, and bye for now.